I'm so excited about this series we've been doing, and my mom did an amazing job last week. And the series is called The Gift. Who was here last week? Who heard my mom? A lot of you. And so today I want to talk about the second gift that the wise men gave. And for those of you who were not here last week, I want to read this. This is Matthew 2, verse 2. And so this is the story of the Magi who visited the Messiah. And so it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Later in verse 9 it says, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Someone say that, overjoyed. On coming to the house, and they saw the child and his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country another route. Now, there's a couple things that are really interesting in this story that I'm really excited to talk about. And so the first thing that's interesting is, why Magi? Why these wise men? I'm sure you've heard the term wise men before, right? The three wise men. When I was a kid, I just thought they were like really wise men. Like maybe they were like the smartest person right in their neighborhood, and they had been drafted in the army of God to go like worship, this new. But that's not the case. So the Magi were actually astrologers and astronomers. So the way to think about them is they were the ancient equivalency to what you would call scientists. And so today we have scientists, we have people in the academy, we have folks that read and study and do studies. But in the ancient world, it was a little bit different. And so they had kind of these wise men, which they called magi. And so they were astrologers, and they're often referred to as priests, definitely pagan background. And what's interesting about them is that they believed in studying the skies for divine messages. Or to put it another way, they believed that what happened in heaven would happen on earth. And so they were always looking for what would happen in the stars as a reflection of what the heavenly realm would do on earth, or what the powers of heaven, of quote, would do on earth. And so what's interesting about this story is that the Magi are not Jews. They aren't Christian. They are probably Zoroastrian priests, which is a big word, but they're astrologers, and so they come, and so it's really interesting that one of the first people that present gifts to the new king, Jesus, are pagans, and there's a really interesting point in there. There's a really important theological underlining that the Gospels is speaking to, and that is that God calls the Magi because Jesus came for everyone. And so often in the ancient world, it was a polytheistic society, so that means there were many gods. And so everyone kind of followed their own gods. And so different groups had gods. Every group had a different god. There was a god for certain cities. There was a god for certain situations. So for instance, if you needed money, there was a god of money. You would go to that god in the temple and you would give an offering and hope that luck would come your way. Or if you had issues with fertility and you wanted kids, there was a god of fertility, and you would go to that god and you'd give something, and you would pray to the god that they would help you. And so it was a polytheistic society, and so every different culture had gods, and those gods kind of stayed to those specific cultures. And so it was very interesting that when Jesus comes on the scene, there's a claim that's being made that not all the other religions were making. And the claim was that this God was not only a living God, but he came for all. Hopefully I'm preaching to somebody. And I want to read this Matthew 28:19. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What's so incredible about the birth of Jesus, it's a statement about what God is interested in doing in the lives of human beings. That God has come and He is interested in your life. It doesn't matter what family you're from. Doesn't matter what country you're from. Doesn't matter what neighborhood you grew up in, what school you went to, what happened in your background. That Jesus has come for you. He is interested in your life, in your story. I think so often we're good as people of just like putting people in boxes and othering everybody. It's true. There's actually a psychological term for it that we use. It's called in-group preference. This is interesting. So a lot of it, this is a real thing. So in-group preference basically means that people naturally desire to be around people like them. And so we're really good at dividing people. And so you feel it. If you go into a neighborhood where there's a lot of people that don't seem like you feel it. Maybe you go to a restaurant, you're stuck at a menu you don't get. There's a little part of you that wishes you were not at that restaurant. Have you ever had that resistance to people different? It's called in-group preference. It's a psychological phenomenon, and it makes a lot of sense because we're tribal creatures as human beings. You think about it, how do we build societies? Well, the basis of any society is a relationship, romantic relationship that turns into a family, that turns into a set of families, that turns into a community, that turns into a county and a nation and a country. You see how it works? And so we're really good at building relationships, and we have a natural desire to get around other people that look like us. And so it's not by accident that we're leery of people. It's kind of in our DNA. We're othering people all the time. Every person you ever meet in your whole life, you're making a decision. Are they with me? Are they against me? Come on, somebody. But you have that feeling. I love telling that story about my grandmother, right? It was the first time I ever had a bad breakup, and I turned to her and I said, Grandma, this is tough. I'm really beat up. And she goes, never trust a woman. And I was like, I don't know if that's great advice, but I'm going to listen to you. And then like a year later, I had the same thing. I got in a business deal, and my business partner didn't do his job, and so it kind of messed everything up. And I went and told my grandmother, and she goes, never trust a man. So I was like, Grandma, if I can't trust women, I can't trust men. My group's getting pretty small. We are like that as people. And so it's important that this story tells us something about God. That Jesus came to everyone. The birth of Jesus had pagans present. Think about that. These are people that didn't even believe in Yahweh. They weren't even from the area. In fact, they were pagan priests. But they're there, led by a star. Because what's going to happen in that little town of Bethlehem is going to change everything for everyone. And in light of the goodness of God, it matters little where you come from. In light of the bigness of God, it matters little the failures that you've had, the challenges that you've had. In light of the love of God, it matters so little the shame that we carry. Because His love comes for everyone. It's powerful. We've been reading this three wise men story and like saying, hey, that's pretty cool. Like there's three wise men on stage, and we kind of just like, but no. This is a big deal. This is a statement about how God thinks and who He's come to and what He's doing. There was no one outside of the touch of God. And so I don't think it's by accident that one of the first people that are there are three men who have no business being there. I'm not sure there's a church in the country that would let those three wise men serve on their volunteer team. Think about that. Oh my gosh. Passages went there. But they were there for the birth of Jesus. Because God had a plan. He saw people. I believe when God looks at this city, he sees folks who have not moved to Yorba Linda yet that will be saved in this church. He sees elementary school kids right now that one day will be in high school, and they will be invited through Feed the Fire to this church. And they'll encounter God. That's how God sees the world. He doesn't care much about our boxes. He's interested in doing what he's doing. Amen? Oh man, I got more to preach. I could just live here. Okay. Other thing of the story that I love is that there's a star. You know, in the ancient world, stars symbolized big events. Because as I said before, that the ancients in the Near East believed that heavenly events signaled earthly change. Heavenly events signaled earthly change. And so stars were common as a symbol of change. And there's a reason that I think that a star is used, because, and this is point number 2 for those of you taking notes, Jesus' reign as king wasn't going to be local or political. It was cosmic. I think so often we think in the local and political. We think about the local. We're stuck in our own stuff. It's easy, right? Am I the only one that gets like, yeah. Lord's been working on me for years. I love a good gossip at Thanksgiving about members of my family. Am I the only one? How's that cousin doing? I saw a crazy post on Instagram 6 months ago. I really want to know what happened. Does anyone know? It's crazy. They were saying some crazy things. Someone's got to know, Grandma, who should I call? Who should I text? I got to find out. Oh my gosh. Is that just me? Am I the only one that the Lord is redeeming and restoring and renewing by faith, on purpose, by grace? I think so often we get so focused in the local. Or as Americans, people in the West, we always get focused on the political. Part of that is because of the culture we grew up in. We have elections every 4 years, and so everything we're just a political culture. That isn't, if you study the arc of history, there's different types of societies and monarchies and governments, and so, but we kind of live in like a political situation. And then culturally, especially in America, like our elections last real long. I don't know if you know this. Like people start running like now. Like there's already conversation about like the future of the Republican and Democratic Party now, and it's like nothing's happened. Like it's crazy. Like so, the average election cycle in America is 2 years. It's nuts. If you go to Europe, it's not the case. They hold what they call snap elections, and they do elections in like 60 days. And it's really bonkers, and they make fun of Americans all the time. Because in Great Britain, which is a really big country, tens of millions of people, they'll do a full election in like 60 days. In the United States, you need like $1 billion in 3 years. Like, we get stuck in the political. And so we get so like wrapped up in the local that we often forget perspective. And I want to read this, Colossians 1:15. This is the description of Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. I think something that we get wrong as a society is we put our politics and our local interests first above our kingship. Does that make sense? I think that's one of the things we get in trouble with, just culturally. Because Jesus' reign is not local, it's not political, it's cosmic. It's cosmic. His reign is bigger than any country. It's bigger than any culture. It's bigger than any person. You know, this is an interesting thing theologically, because for those of you who study theology, so out of all the major religions of the world, Christianity has the most theology written by far. So if you're like a scholar in Islam, for example, you can pretty much read all the major Islamic scholars. It's kind of true about almost every religion. And the reason for that is because most religions in the world, they are wedded to a culture. So in order to, for example, in the case of Islam, that the Islamic scriptures are written in a language, and you have to learn that language to learn what's said. Does that make sense? So that's kind of true, just different religions. So for those of you who did not know, I studied 7 years academic theology, so it's kind of my area. And so if you are a theologian in Christianity, there's so much theology. There's so much. No person could ever read it all. So you have to specialize. You can't specialize in theology. You specialize in systematics or Old Testament or New Testament, because the breadth of work is so much. There's so many Christian scholars who are doing theology, who are thinking about God in every language. Does that make sense? So if you want a PhD in theology, you don't just learn Greek and Hebrew. You got to learn German. I mean, I'm not kidding. You have to learn a bunch of different languages. Because if just to study Christian theology, it's like, well, the Reformation was in Germany, and this was over here, and then the Anglicans now are really taking over, and so right now the big thing is in Africa, and so you have a bunch of new. Well, why is that, Pastor Stefan? What's cool about Christianity is that Christianity doesn't need one culture. It creates culture. It can exist in any language. And so the good news of Jesus can engage with anyone in any language. And so Christianity, the gospel, is always creating culture, because it enters into a culture. It has English, German, French. And then it also destroys some of the bad culture. So it's always working. And I think that's interesting, because for many other religions, the way that they think is there's one culture, one language, one book, and if you want to adapt, you got to adapt to that culture, language, and book. But in Christianity, our message is global. It's universal. It can go anywhere. And so that's that cosmic part of this. We're a part of a global church. We're a part of a people of God. There's a really great biblical doctrine called community of the saints. So we don't have it as much as Protestantism, but you have it a lot in church history. And the idea is that when you say yes to God and you join His church, you join the people of God who are living and have lived. And so everywhere you go, you roll as a team. You're a part of the community of the saints. You're part of the collective witness of the goodness of God on earth. You share in the history that we have in the Bible, which is a collective witness of the goodness of God in the first 100 years of the church. And so we're a part of that. And we are shaped by it. And we are shaped by this in light of the divinity of Jesus. And so I want to get to this point 3, which is the gift of frankincense. My mom talked about gold, is that when the Magi came to Jesus, they first gave gold, which is his kingship. But they also give frankincense, which spoke to the divinity of Jesus. Frankincense was a really interesting thing. So it was a perfume. Basically, it was made from tree resin. For those of you who are my podcast people who like too much information. And it was basically a perfume. You burn it. And it was forbidden for personal use. In Exodus, there's a law where you could only use it. It was really special and very prized and very expensive. And it had a very specific smell and scent. And it was only used by the priests in the temple. And you couldn't buy it and go home with it. It was only used in the holies of holies. It was only used in very special places. And Psalms 141:2 says, "Let me pray to be counted as incense before you, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." There's a couple of things that frankincense would do. The first thing it would do in the holies of holies when they would light it is it would smell. And it would have this aroma, and so it would transform the atmosphere. And so when you got around it, you immediately knew you were in the presence of God. It changed the atmosphere through, we experience things through the senses, and so one is smell. And so you walk into the temple and you could immediately smell it coming out of the holies of holies. It was a very specific, it would change the atmosphere. The second thing it would do is when you burnt it, the smoke would rise up. And it symbolized our prayers being risen to heaven. And so it was a really beautiful thing. And so the priests would do this, and they would often do it in forms of worship. And so they would burn the incense, which represented the presence of God, the change of the atmosphere. And then the smoke would rise, which represented that the Lord hears the prayers of his people. And so the priests had a really important job in this position to essentially be the mediator. And so when the Magi come and give the frankincense, they're acknowledging something about God, about who Jesus will be. Jesus is the living temple on earth. He is the presence of God. And so everywhere Jesus goes, he brings God's presence. In Israel, the way that they thought about it was that the temple was the place where heaven and earth met. It was really special, which is why they would travel there and stuff. But that was the temple on earth. But Jesus was the living temple. That was the messianic promise that one day that heaven and earth would come together in a person. And instead of it being a holies of holies in a brick building that no one could get to, it would be a living, breathing person that would walk around and bring God's touch to the world. And Jesus was the living temple. That's the idea of incarnation. That he was 100% human. We could touch him, feel him, have dinner with him. He knows our fears. He knows our full experience of life. But he's also 100% divine. He's heaven and earth in one. And so the gift of frankincense was a foreshadow of who Jesus was going to be. That everywhere he went, he would bring the presence of God. Everywhere he went, he would change the atmosphere. Everywhere he went, the folks that would meet him, God would hear his prayers because he heard their prayers. There's that great story in the Bible that says that, where he forgives sins. And they get mad at him. They go to him and say, "Who gives you the right to forgive sins?" They should have been there on day one. If they would have saw that frankincense, they would have got it. Because again, it was outlawed. It was the only place you could have it was in God, in the presence. And so my final point is that Jesus is the high priest. You know, a priest had a real interesting job. They were the mediator between regular people and God. That's what they were. So if you were a regular Jew in Israel, and you lived on a farm, and you wanted to talk to God or appeal to God, you would go to the temple, which was a physical place on earth, and you would provide a sacrifice. And the folks that would mediate that sacrifice were the priests. And they would make sure it'd be done right. And they would, in light of the sacrifice, they would light the frankincense. And they would facilitate your prayers being heard to God. That's their role. And so when we say Jesus is the high priest, it's a promise about how God was going to reshape the way we interact with him. I think so often we feel like God is up there, we're down here, and the elevator don't always work. But in Jesus, we can make our appeals to him. And he is the high priest. He is the priest of priests. Hebrews 4:14, if the worship team wants to come up. Who's learning something today? Yeah. Since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. I'll tell you something. When you know that your prayers are heard by the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, it's a little easier to hold on to that faith. Confidence. That's what we get from God. We get that confidence. Give the Lord one more clap. I write in my notes, in the Old Testament, priests burned incense in the temple, representing the prayers of the people rising to God. Like a translator, a priest makes communication possible between God and his people, and vice versa. So the priest would make sure that you could pray to God, but he could also make sure to help get you an answer. Jesus, and these are my notes, these are good notes. Jesus doesn't just act like a priest. He is, someone say is, the bridge between heaven and earth. His priestly role ensures that our prayers and that God's will is revealed to humanity. It's a promise. It's a divine gift. You know what's so cool about the story is that gift of frankincense that the wise men gave to that baby Jesus, it reflected in a small way the divine gift God was going to give us through his Son. And in this case, in the gift of frankincense, that gift was to have direct access to the Father. It's a heck of a gift to be in your life with all the stuff, with all the insecurities, you just being you, and at any time, you can go to God. But he won't just hear your prayer. His presence will come to you, and he will fill your house. And he will pour into your life. He will pour into the lives of your children's children. The presence of God is a divine gift from the Lord. And every December, we celebrate that gift. And I want to challenge every person in this room, whenever you read this story and you hear about that frankincense, just imagine frankincense being lit and the smoke going to heaven. And then remind yourself, those are my prayers. The Lord hears my prayers. He's in my life. I am made whole in Him. I have direct access to Him. He sees me. He's with me. Where I walk, I don't walk alone. For the presence of God is on me. I am an anointed child of heaven. And everywhere I go, Jesus is in me. And if He's the living temple, if He's the place on earth that heaven and earth meet, and He lives in me, and I live in Yorba Linda, then Yorba Linda is the place where heaven and earth are going to come together. I'm done preaching. Let's give the Lord a clap.